Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Red Light Exposé. My name is Andrea Hines and I am a woman who spent 7 years in the commercial sex industry in licensed and regulated brothels in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I'm one of the hosts here at Red Light Exposé podcast as part of our collective. And I am so excited for who we have joining us today, which is not only someone I greatly respect for the work that he does, but also someone that I consider a very close friend of mine and confidant and supporter in the work that I do as well. So today is Paul Laverne. Paul is a registered psychotherapist with a Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology from Yorkville University. He has received training from the American Association of Sex Addiction Therapists and is a certified sexual recovery therapist. Paul is also a member of the Ontario Association of Mental Health Professionals, as well as the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario. Paul lives and works here in Canada in a city called Peterborough, which is in Ontario, where he has had a private practice since about 2011. As a therapist, he enjoys helping couples solve their relational problems, develop better intimacy and communication skills, and reconnect emotionally. He has also helped individuals dealing with stress, anger, depression, anxiety, affairs, sexual dysfunctions, and sexually compulsive behaviors. And by sexually compulsive behaviors, that includes things such as porn use, serial hookups, paying for sex, visiting strip clubs, and things of the like. So obviously on that last note about sexually compulsive behaviors, that's obviously a lot of the work that we do here at Red Light Exposé, both as a collective and as individuals. And so it was only natural that we became friends with Paul. And I think I speak for many of us on the podcast who know him, that he's someone that we really look up to and cherish as a really good role model for men, and also a really good guiding light of some really helpful insights to help them really kind of discover, what they're partaking in when they're engaging in the commercial sex industry or going, I guess, off the beaten path, if you will, when it comes to their sexual activities. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. Really happy that you're here today.
Hey, thanks, Andrea, for having me. I'm really happy to be here on your podcast.
Great. Well, where to start? Okay. Whenever you look at your resume, it's quite impressive. And I thought to myself when I was planning for this conversation, what do we even touch on? Like, where do we even go with this? Because I really feel like every time you and I connect, we cover so many topics, and there is so many topics to cover that I wanted to keep it somewhat narrow in scope. And I know that we've, had conversations before. You've graciously had me on your podcast twice, I think it was, right? Yeah. And so listeners, if you aren't aware that Paul has a YouTube channel, please check it out. It is phenomenal. He has done some really impressive interviews with a lot of really fascinating people. So lots of wealth of information that we can steal from Paul in this time that we have with him. But I really want to make this conversation one about men and one for men. So I think what I really do want to focus on is obviously what we care most about at this podcast, which is the commercialization of sex. So again, that includes, being a consumer of pornography. So not just being a sex buyer of in-person sex, but also just consuming prostitution and like some of the things that you deal with your clients, things like webcamming and all that, visiting strip clubs, like we mentioned. So I'm really hoping that we can keep it narrow to kind of talking about the impact that these things have on men, even though we know that women obviously do participate in the commercial sex industry, both as buyers and sellers, especially around pornography, probably, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in comparison to sex buying, I would say more women watch pornography than they do purchase sex. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, the vast majority of sex buyers are men.
But women we know are lower on that scale. But when it comes to porn, they're a bit more higher frequency in that regard than any other area of the sex
Yeah,
industry.
it's hard to get statistics on who watches porn, whether you break it down by men or women. Probably 50 to 60% of men minimum watch porn or consume it on a fairly regular basis. Uh, the fastest growing, I think with women, it's somewhere around 25 to 30%. But the fastest growing demographic of porn watchers is women 18 to 25. And partly because the industry has targeted that demographic specifically in creating products that cater to their sensibilities. I've never met a woman that's paid for sex, so I'm sure they're out there. Maybe that's happened, but the vast majority of sex buyers, probably 95 to 99%, are men.
Wow. Yeah.
Mm.
Interesting. Well, and so again, we could kind of go down these little pathways of talking about these little not micro issues, but like micro focusing on certain issues. But like you said, it is a highly gendered activity of more so men. So that's where I really do want to kind of center our conversation around men, hoping that, they'll be able to have some introspection and also make some changes in their lives, which could improve not only themselves, but the lives of the people around them, particularly women. So, oh, where to start? I guess my
Yeah.
first question would
Mm.
be, can you summarize modern day porn for us? What is it? What do people expect, or what can they expect to see if they were to just go to any given porn site on any given day? Because I know porn has changed over the years, and I think a lot of perhaps older generations or people who are not heavy or regular porn consumers don't really understand the changes that have come about in the levels of violence
Yeah.
against women that are depicted in pornography. Kind of how we started going down, some really deviant areas of, bestiality, consensual, non-consensual, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, can you just kind of give us maybe like, what you're seeing on these porn sites, or what your clients in your therapy practice are telling you are sort of like what constitutes mainstream pornography right now?
Yeah, for sure. So I turned 56 next week, so I've been around the block a couple times, so I can give a little bit of perspective from when I was a kid coming up, and pornography was basically synonymous with Playboy. So for any viewers or listeners, listeners of this podcast who think that's what we're talking about, that's not what we're talking about when we say pornography. Um, I was exposed to porn as a kid and through my teenage years, in the form of, Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler were the main magazines that were out there. And it wasn't until the 80s that VHS cassettes came out and started to portray graphic sex, meaning, actual oral sex or actual full penetration sex acts, not simulated sex acts. There was a lot of simulated sex acts probably already going on late night TV. On Friday or Saturday, you could catch a movie on late night that would feature mostly simulated sex acts. The internet changed everything in the 90s. I didn't even get a computer till I was 25, and we had modems back then. Remember the modems, Andrea? Where you
Oh yeah, the dial up
dial-up, the
and
dial-up,
making all the
yeah.
weird noises, and
Yeah, make the weird noises and take 5 minutes to download a single picture. So internet pornography wasn't really very widely used or common for the first few years of the internet, believe it or not, because it was just too slow and video technology hadn't been developed. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of internet technology was specifically developed and driven by the porn industry, especially digital technology, different point of view technology, multiple camera angles, and those sort of things were brought into videos because of the influence of the porn industry. So when high-speed internet hit, which was late 90s, 2000, I feel like high speed's been around about 20 years, right? So
I
let's
think
let's
so.
say let's say 2000, early 2000s. So that was a game changer, and you saw a massive proliferation of pornographic websites. So in the last 20 years, the nature of porn itself has changed dramatically. So people typically think porn is men and women having sex. So that would just be sort of the base entry point of what pornography is now. Since then, it has become extremely graphic, unfiltered, violent, abusive, a lot of degrading, dehumanizing, and objectifying behaviors. And I would actually classify it as a form of propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the definition of propaganda, which is, I'm going to read a definition. It's a deliberate and systematic effort to disseminate or promote particular ideas in order to influence the beliefs, thoughts, or actions of others. Propaganda utilizes symbols, images, and slogans to create messages designed to persuade others to a specific way of thinking. This is a very accurate description of the modern pornography industry.
Mm-hmm.
This is a multi-billion-dollar global industry that has, sales teams, marketing teams, board of directors, CEOs, and everything else that any other corporation would have. And they have business plans and they have business goals. And if you look at pornography as a form of propaganda, it is essentially all men are entitled to instantly access women's bodies and access sexual acts whenever they want without limitation, censorship, or having anything filtered. And women exist as sex objects to meet men's sexual desires and can be treated in any way in which they deem fit. That would sort of sum up if you look at porn as propaganda, that would probably sum up the messaging pretty accurately. So I used to be a porn user and I haven't used porn in 20 years. So I haven't actually personally been exposed to the type of dark, abusive, horrifying degradation that makes up a lot of modern pornography. So it was shocking to me when I started to research, and read Gail Dines' book Pornland. That's a great resource for anyone looking for something. I didn't realize how dark it had become, and it actually is starting to turn into something that doesn't have anything to do with sex. It seems to have to do with hating women and degrading them. And it's obvious this is very intentional, and it's obvious that this is the goal of the person making the pornography, is to hurt the people in the pornography. And then you actually have genres, and people might go, what, there's genres? Yes, there's many genres of porn out there. And I think they sort of speak for themselves. Rape porn is a genre. So you can go online right now, your child can too, by the way, and Google rape porn and instantly be able to watch videos of women being raped.
Mm-hmm. And people will say, oh, that's not actual rape because the woman has consented to it. It's actually consensual, non-consensual. So it's like this way of repackaging what is ultimately rape porn, because that sex is coerced, which is void of consent naturally, therefore genuine sexual consent. But then also that does have that violent component, like what you spoke of, like where it's not just, caring, respectful, trustworthy penis and vagina intercourse. It is acts of filmed sexual violence rather than filmed sexual intercourse.
Well, it's actually both. So you have actors portraying scenarios of rape, and then you have women actually being raped. Because the people, the way porn sites work are they're called, think of it as a tube site like YouTube. So Pornhub, for example, the world's largest porn company, Pornhub doesn't make porn.
Mm-hmm.
They host porn. Pornhub's just a platform. So a guy can have, this happens and has happened, a guy can have a girl at his house, get her drunk or drug her, and rape her and film his friends raping her and upload it onto Pornhub. That's it. And then people will watch that. And then back to what you said before, though, to the person watching, to your brain, it doesn't distinguish between these are actors and actresses consenting or this is an actual woman being raped. It doesn't know the difference. Just like if you watch a hockey game that I recorded last night and I don't tell you it's a recording, your brain can't differentiate between whether the game is live or whether the game is a recording. It doesn't matter.
That's a good analogy. Yeah, the
Yeah,
brain can't decipher.
Yeah, so the impact to the user is the same, right? So, by the way, Pornhub, which is owned by MindGeek, is located in Montreal. They were guilty of hosting so many images of non-consensual sex, child sexual abuse material, and rape that they were subpoenaed by our government to account for their actions. There was an article written about them in the New York Times. They pulled down 10 million of their videos. And basically, it's just been one scandal after another when you pull back the layers and look at what's happening. They have something like 20, what do they call them? The people that review the videos. They have like thousands of videos uploaded a day, and there's like 20 people that are supposedly auditing these videos.
Apparently, there was only one person who was assigned to that job previously. I think if I'm recalling Layla Mickelwait's quote, or not quote, but a tweet that she had made in relation to the Trafficking Hub campaign that they're doing. I think she said that there was a backlog of, at any given time, like tens of thousands of videos awaiting review that had not been. And I think she said they had to pull down 80% of their content when the lights started getting shone on them for their activities.
So it's an interesting social experiment because if you ask the question, what if we allowed anybody to create sexualized content without restriction? Would it create a gigantic cesspool of abuse, hatred, depravity, exploitation, and horror? And the answer is yes, it would. And in fact, it has. Mm-hmm. And that's any porn site that you want to go on. And don't get me started about ethical porn and but what about people that just sit down and agree to film themselves having sex and no one's getting hurt? If you feel the need to do that, great, go right ahead. But that's not where my concern is per se. I think I have issues with that, and maybe for other reasons. But for the purposes of you and I talking, Andrea, it's about this stuff that is clearly and obviously causing harm to the people that are making this material and viewing and consuming this material. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just very exploitative by nature, where I think if you look at it with a critical lens, if you aren't completely desensitized, which, comes about unfortunately by habitually watching porn, if you don't get to that point, I think for the average person, it does hit you with some feeling of ick, like almost, through like obscenity, and I know that that's kind of always been the debate, right? What is erotic or erotica, as they would call it, versus something that is obscene? And that's a hard thing to nail down because, like you said, it comes into ethics. And I think ethics are influenced heavily by people's exposure and people's education that they've had around these issues. And when it's this propaganda, like what you said, it's a very distorted message that the masses are receiving, where they don't really have that mindset at that time to be able to be like, this is propaganda, this is what they're pushing. But it's very interesting because once you wake up to that, you see it very quickly, and you can notice when there's power differentials, or when it's, like you said, pushing this narrative of women being, subservient or objectified, controlled, and that being arousing for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and every taboo is explored in porn. So it's funny because people talk about, upload videos where there's only express consent. But then why is there a genre of no? She says no. There's literally a genre of no consent.
Yeah. Well, and
who
what's
are we fooling here?
What's so interesting about that too is like there used to be, and I spend a lot of time on porn sites, not as a porn consumer myself,
Yeah.
but just people send me clips or they say,
Mhm.
check this out. This is really horrifying.
Research.
Research, yeah.
Yeah.
The sad research.
But actually research, not just like I'm doing, you get caught by your wife. I'm just doing research, like
Yeah, yeah.
actually doing it. Yeah.
Genuine research, yeah. So when I'm, doing this research, people will often, come back and say, well, porn is not, showing rape videos. I can go on to Pornhub and I can type rape videos and nothing will come up. Not a single video. And I say, yeah, but again, that's because there has been backlash, thankfully, to the tagging of a lot of these videos. And so now they have banned those words because it was such a popular genre that, it was really breeding that culture.
Mhm.
And so they said, okay, well, we don't want to be accused of hosting rape videos. So we're going to then make it forced. So that's now the keyword, forced,
Mhm.
or again, CNC for consensual, non-consensual. So those videos are still out there, probably more than there ever have been, but it's this rebranding of it
Mhm.
to try to soften it and sanitize it and eroticize it where it's not such a harsh word like rape, which we would hope most people would have a visceral reaction to.
Well, and it raises an interesting question, like from a sociological or psychological perspective. Who are these people? Like, where is this insatiable demand for watching women be forced to have sex that they don't want to have coming from?
Yeah, and people argue, well, that's just a primal urge, right? It's not actually uh, a rape that people want to fantasize about. It's the aggression, and oh, we've taken away men's ability to be men, and to them, that is that domination of women and that aggression. And I think that's kind of where we have to start looking at, why are we kind of weaving that into our notions of masculinity in the public sphere? Like, why can't we allow men to be gentle and tender and loving and caring? Like, why does it have to have that kind of alpha male, hyper aggression energy to it for people to want to watch it? I just don't understand.
Yeah, well, I think men that watch that have an eroticized rage. So the men I work with compulsive sexual behaviors have eroticized all their emotions. This is part of why they are emotionally undeveloped. So if you take, and there's different reasons that men are drawn to this, but a very common one is a man who has experienced maybe a lot of rejection. It could have been starting in childhood, right from his mother. Maybe she was demeaning and shaming to him ongoingly. Maybe he felt like, and I'm not making excuses, I'm just explaining how this stuff comes about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he grew up feeling like an outsider, feeling like a loser. Let's say on top of all that, he's shy and introverted, so he has a hard time talking to girls. He feels like a social outcast in high school. He tries to work up the courage to ask Sally out in grade 10 math class to the dance, and she laughs at his face and calls him a loser. And then so let's add like 100 of these little things over his life, and now he's 21 years old and he has a lot of rage against women, and it becomes eroticized through pornography. And so this is how this is why, maybe even subconsciously, may not be aware of it, but there's something about that scenario that draws him to that as a vent for his pain. I think pain attracts pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like love attracts love, pain attracts pain. So men literally go to that to numb their pain, or because it's not like, let's say let's say the man that I just described, the hypothetical man I just described, is watching a video of a man taking sex and dominating a woman even though she's resisting, and he's enforcing his will on her. Okay. So it's very similar to a video game where, there's a popular video game called Halo, where the main character never takes off his mask, and they do this, the Master Chief, and they do that on purpose because they want the player to project themselves onto the character, right? So when that man is watching that rape video, he is the man in the video. He's inserting himself into this scenario and drawing a sense of power and control vicariously through that scenario. So there's an extremely powerful emotional appeal that he may take pleasure in knowing that she's being harmed, but it might not be about that as much as he takes pleasure in being able to finally have a form of control over his sexuality.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that kind of makes sense then about like the rise in POV pornography, which listener, maybe you're probably aware of this, but it's point of view, porn, which is you don't tend to see the man much in those videos. So it's almost as if like the guy is holding or has like a GoPro camera
on his head or something.
Something like that. Yeah. Cause you'll never see his face, and that when you spoke about like the Halo character, like that makes sense, right? It allows you to kind of embody that energy and that feeling that you're not going to likely get unless you go become an actual sex offender in quote unquote real life. We know porn is real life, but
the reason for the POV porn is specifically to facilitate the insertion of the viewer into the scenario. So there is, you kind of know there's a man involved in that, but he's almost for all intents and purposes invisible, and you are inserting yourself into what he's doing to the woman.
I've seen porn clips where the men are wearing like those Mexican wrestler masks and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, that's not trying to put them in the POV position, but there it's a whole nother layer too of, the women are clearly what is selling the porn and what people are coming to watch be brutalized. So, a lot of men, they honor their anonymity, whereas a lot of women don't even get that opportunity to remain anonymous in pornography. They have to show their face and expose every capacity of themselves, but the men are just there to be the brutalizer and the inflictor of the harm to some degree. So lots of layers about that with not only trying to put the man into that position, but also trying to absolve men of their role in being a part of the production of pornography as well.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
So when we talk about sex buyers and porn consumers, basically anyone who participates in the commercial sex industry on the demand side, what do you use as a measure to determine when it is problematic? So obviously, my position, which is that any and all of commercialized sex is problematic because it is sexually exploitative in nature. But I'm wondering from like a therapy stance or the therapist world, is there a specific amount or frequency of porn consumption that therapists consider quote unquote unhealthy? Is there an amount that categorizes someone as a porn addict rather than a porn user? And I guess on that note, can you give us some general definitions about compulsive sexual behavior and kind of break it down for us as to what that actually looks like?
Yeah, I prefer the term compulsive sexual behavior. And the term sex addict comes, under criticism by some people because they say, well, if sex addiction was like a cocaine addiction, you would see structural changes in the brain, which does happen, by the way, but they say it doesn't. And the antidote would be to never have sex. So there's kind of a flawed way of thinking. Like if you're a cocaine addict, then the goal is never have cocaine. And if you're a sex addict, you never have sex. But that's also different from a pornography addiction. And then there's other behaviors as well, like, going on OnlyFans and cam girls, sexting, texting, paying for sex, escorts, going to strip clubs, massage parlors. And at the end of the day, they all act like a drug in the sense that they produce a massive dopamine hit, an altered state, and they numb emotion. So the end result, whether it's alcohol or cocaine or gambling or compulsive sexual behaviors, the end result is altering mood and numbing emotion. But as far as the actual questions to ask, it's pretty simple. And these are questions that clinicians have been using for years and years. So number one is, have you tried to cut back on your behavior or stop and failed to do so? So if you've tried to stop looking at porn or cut back your porn use and you haven't been able, and you've done that repeatedly, that would be the first sign that you have an addiction. And because, like you said, you mentioned earlier, like just because you drink alcohol, it doesn't make you an alcoholic, right? But if you were wondering if you were, first thing I would ask you is, Andrew, have you ever tried to actually quit drinking and not been able to? And you're like, yeah, I've never gone more than a week without having a drink, no matter how hard I try. And I have lots of clients who have never gone 2 weeks in their entire adult life without masturbating to pornography. So then the second question is, do you continue the behavior despite negative consequences? And that can be a range of things like consequences to yourself, your mood, your emotions, your self-esteem, how you feel about yourself. Could it be negative consequences to your relationships? Because by far, the greatest negative consequence to someone in a relationship is that they're lying about it or keeping it a secret, right?
And is that for them, like the bigger consequence for them of carrying that secret? Or is it the family who has to deal with the deception and the lies and not knowing? Or is it kind of an equal combination of both, would you say?
I think the first thing is that the person is afraid. Well, they lie for two reasons. They're shamed, and they believe that if they tell their wife, it will hurt her too much. And what she doesn't know won't hurt her. That's essentially always the starting point.
But that's kind of promising then, right? That it sounds like he is caring about her well-being rather than she will find out and she will leave me, which is two totally different things. So, I mean, that part is encouraging.
Yeah, but I actually know, like when I actually dig under, because I hear this so many times, then I challenge the guy. And I'm like, no, you're actually protecting yourself from your discomfort of her negative emotion. So you're still really just thinking about yourself. You're not actually thinking about her. And that is actually the case. They do agree with me when I point that out. I've hardly ever had a guy that didn't agree with that when I pointed it out to him. So that was the second question, negative consequences. Number three is tolerance, and has your behavior escalated? So tolerance is a physiological phenomenon where when you ingest a stimulant, your brain develops, it becomes less sensitive to it. I'm oversimplifying it here, but again, if you think of alcohol, you used to get feeling pretty good on one drink. You'd have one beer, you'd get a buzz, right? Remember the very first time you had a beer? Do you remember?
Well, I was never a beer drinker. I went straight to the tequila.
Straight to the hard stuff, yeah. So that first shot felt pretty good, right? Mm-hmm. But if you had a shot of tequila every day, after a very short amount of time, probably a month, that shot would have a markedly diminished effect on you because your brain's built tolerance. So you escalate to 2 shots, and you do that for a month. And then the 2 shots has the same effect as the 1 shot. So you escalate to 3 shots, okay? So let's take you through escalation of pornography. And I'll use myself as an example because, like I said, I've been around a while. So my first pictures of women were the Sears catalog. And all the guys my age have a laugh about that because it's like, it was just innocent childhood, like women, and you don't know what women look like in underwear or bathing suits. So you see in the Sears catalog, it's like, oh, that's what women wear under their clothes. Okay?
Yeah, swimsuits, all those
swimsuits, and it's just a new childhood curiosity thing. But it sort of plants the seed a bit, and then you go from there to maybe lingerie catalogs or swimsuit catalogs that are purposefully more sensualized, right? Like the models in Sears they're just standing there posing, and there's nothing overtly sensual about it.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go to Playboys. Now you have your first fully naked person that you're seeing. So that's another level of escalation. But there's no sex acts in Playboy. So Playboy never had sex between men and women. But you can go for that. You can go to Penthouse for that. So Penthouse would have guy, girl, and girl, and two guys and a girl, or two girls and a guy. So there's like 4 more levels of escalation. See, like people take this, like people just open the fire hose now with internet porn and just start drinking from the fire hose. But the way I came up, because of my age, it was much more subtle. There was much more of these little levels of escalation, but they all were escalation. Then you go to Hustler, which is just raunchier, and their whole brand is raunch. They're just like, we're filthy and we're proud of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So more explicit and degrading sex acts, maybe 4 or 5 people, a little bit of a mini orgy going on in Hustler. So there you have 4 or 5 levels of escalation. Each step of the way, my brain is building up a greater tolerance to the stimulus, right, to the dopamine. So far we're in 2D pictures. We haven't even gone to video yet. So then, like I said earlier, the 80s come around. Maybe we catch some stuff like at the odd R-rated movie that might show some nudity. Then VHS has come out, and we start getting into, very graphic, simulated, or actual sex acts. And again, though, that's the amount is limited to what you can rent and watch in a given night or a week, right? And even in a full-length porn movie, there's maybe 3 to 4 scenes where sex actually takes place. And the joke was like, no one watches the plot; they just fast forward to the good stuff, right?
Yeah. The pizza storyline got pretty tired for people quickly, I think.
Yeah, the plumber came over, and all of a sudden, they're having sex on the kitchen table. Like, what happened to the sink, right? I thought the sink was clogged. He's unclogging. No, it's not the kitchen sink he's interested in. So, and then, then there was a period of time where the DVDs were starting to come out, and then you could get the DVDs with the magazines, right? And then the internet came, high-speed internet. And then 10x or 100x the escalation at that point, because the variety, like if you go back to when, the 70s, where you got a subscription to Playboy, once a month you would get a magazine that might have 30 pictures in it, and there's no sex acts. Okay. Mm-hmm. So in a year, you might have maybe 300 to 350 pictures that you could look at in a year.
Unless you were trading with your friend's dad, swap some out in the bathroom or whatever and get a new stash of them. But the access, you're right, it was much lessened.
Yeah. And that would pretty much wear, like you actually get that. Let's say that was the only magazine you had, that would wear off in a month, and it wouldn't actually be that exciting. But then the next month, the new one would come out. So now with the internet and smartphones, kids can do 350 pictures in an hour. Mm-hmm. So they can access more in an hour than someone could in a year.
That's quite terrifying.
And it's not even it's still apples and oranges, because we're talking about graphic videos now, not just pictures, 2-dimensional pictures, right? Mm-hmm. So I compare it to, drinking from an eyedropper, a drop at a time, to a fire hose, right? Where it's literally the level of stimulation is literally so excessive that after a while, the circuits get completely overloaded and shut down and stop working. And that's how you have 22-year-old men that have porn-induced erectile dysfunction. They literally can't have sex because they've consumed thousands of hours and tens of thousands of graphic sex acts before they're even 25 years old. And their partner is just not arousing to them because they're a real person. So those are the first three questions I ask. And the last one would be with a question about withdrawal. So a sign of that you're addicted to something is that you have withdrawal when you can't access the behavior or the substance. So this is tricky for some people to answer because they're not necessarily aware that when they can't, let's say, go to a massage parlor or they can't watch porn, that it's affecting them. But most of the time when they think about it, they're like, yeah, I get irritable, I get angry, I have repetitive intrusive thoughts, I can't stop thinking about it. Some people get the shakes, they feel physical symptoms. I've seen men that have withdrawal from masturbation, like they masturbate every day for years. And when they just stop cold turkey, they feel it physically in their body, and then it passes after a few days. So there's other things too, but those would essentially be the questions, and a few other things like specific to sexual behaviors that I see are, that are signs of problematic behavior are, you feel like you're living a double life, like just in general, like is there a whole part of your life that you're not keeping from your partner, but that you're keeping from your partner? Do you have secret emails that she doesn't know about? Do you have secret social media accounts that she doesn't know about? Do you make sure that she doesn't access your phone because you're having conversations or, going on apps or sites that that she wouldn't be okay with? And that might seem obvious, but those would be some other things I would ask them. They all sort of add up to indicate, that there's an issue going on. So hopefully that kind of answers the question of, sort of how to separate the recreational user from the problematic user of porn and sex.
Yeah, no, that was a really good detailing of that. And I guess my question is, probably not, but do men have to meet, say, like two of those criteria to kind of constitute, being in a state of sexual compulsion? Or is it more like if there's even just one of those things, but they're very, very extreme? Like, I guess it's kind of a sliding scale of how that's measured on a case by case basis.
Well, it warrants further discussion because I've never told anyone they're a porn addict. I just ask the questions and I let them tell me, right? And then we go from there. Like, I'm not out to label anybody. It's not my agenda, but it's to ask them honest questions to get them to reflect on their behavior. And honestly, like vast majority of guys that find me, like they already know there's a problem, right? They haven't clearly delineated what it is, but they're aware that there's something up with this. So we'll talk about it. But once in a while, it's funny because I'll ask guys like that first question, have you ever tried to cut back or stop your behavior? And the answer is no. So it's actually not a helpful question because they've never tried to quit porn.
Yeah.
And sometimes they even say yes to the second one because maybe they're single or they've never had a long-term relationship more than 6 months, or they just always hit it, or they were with a girl that was like, you want to watch porn, go right ahead, that's fine with me. So they don't have any negative consequences to report. So that's what I mean about having further conversations, so I just let's delve into that a little bit. And I don't think there's ever been a case where there hasn't been negative consequences. It's just sometimes they're just not aware. They're not very aware of it because the thing with asking questions and basing your conclusions on their self-report is they can only self-report on what they're aware of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And if they're not aware of it, then they will tell you, no, that hasn't affected me. And they're not lying to you. They just don't really have an awareness of it.
Well, and that kind of goes right into the question I was just going to ask you is, do you think most men are aware of the destructive nature of their compulsive sexual behavior or behaviors? Or do you think that most of them are kind of operating on this state of like autopilot? Like, is there a degree of dissociation that's required? Are they like, gaslighting themselves, like reframing the behavior in their minds most commonly? Because obviously they're at your doorstep, right? Like they're in your office. So something must have led them there or prompted that. But But like you said, it sort of seems like many of them just haven't been challenged by, a sex saturated society that really tells them like this is fine. But do you
Yeah.
think deep down they must know to some degree, or are they just so desensitized that they're in that state of dissociation and lying to themselves?
Yeah. Well, I guess I should say, when I answer that question, I should distinguish a little bit when we say, people, or people I see, or men, because there's a certain amount of the population I don't work with, like rapists and pedophiles. So I don't work with rapists and pedophiles.
And is that because you think that they probably need more help than what you could give in that context? Like they need, greater
It's more I just don't want to work with them.
justifiable. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
fair.
that's just not my. I don't have the training and specialized knowledge in specific, because that's like I work with compulsive sexual behaviors, and that's a subset within that of its own, and also just don't feel that I want to work with that population.
That's fair. Yeah, we have our John school here, and that's one of our criteria. You cannot have been charged with any type of sexual offense against a child, or
Right.
violence against women to any degree, like a sexual assault charge or anything like that, to participate in the program. So, but for us, it's usually same thing. We just don't feel like that program meets their needs. Like they need far more than what
Right.
some general empathy training essentially, and
Right.
information can provide them.
Well, and that leads to the next thing, which is there's a certain percentage of the population that we would define as sociopaths and or sadists.
Mm-hmm.
So, and unfortunately, I'm sure many of the survivors, I know there's a lot of survivors behind the scenes on this podcast, yourself included, Andrea, that have know firsthand the experience of being confronted by someone who is devoid of empathy,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
or a
absolutely.
sociopath, and or a sadist who actually derives pleasure from inflicting pain on other people. Okay?
Yes. Yeah.
So there is a segment of the population that seeks sexual access to women for money so they can harm them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the
That's that
average
eroticized.
person is like, oh my God, how can you do that? Well, like I said, they don't have a conscience, and they don't have empathy, and they don't have remorse for what they do, and they get pleasure, such as that may be, from inflicting harm on other people.
And that's probably different than the eroticized rage that you spoke about earlier, right? Like
Yes.
that's like the deadened soul of somebody where, like, I don't know if they can't come back, but I kind of think that there are some that unfortunately can't come back when they're that
I think
void of
so.
any humanity.
I think so too. So the majority of people that I work with are very, if you met my clients, like if you just ran into them on the street, talk to them, you just think they're normal, nice guys, normal people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are married, they have kids, they work jobs, they're, contributing members of society, they pay the tax, they like watching baseball, they take their kids to the fair, like they're just normal people. And I've had interns here over the years, and they've sat in a lot of my sessions with sex addicts, and they're like, yeah, he's like a normal guy. He just seems like a normal guy. So, right. But back to your question of awareness, the awareness is very low. It's very low, right? So when we talk of awareness in general term, it can apply to everyone in terms of just how socially aware are people, how spiritually aware, how emotionally aware. So there's a lot of ways in which we all walk in a degree of awareness to a greater or lesser degree in our lives. What I found with a lot of the people I work with is there's very little emotional connection to the impact of their behavior on the other person, specifically, the person, let's say, they're paying for sexual access to. And there's a few reasons for that. So one of them is, the ability to compartmentalize things. Like men, I don't know why, but men are really good at this. I don't think
Yes.
women. I always say women live in one compartment called relationships and emotions, but men live in many compartments called, work, kids, wife, girlfriend, beer, sex, sports, prostitutes, motorcycles, cars, guitar, whatever they're, and these are all boxes that they have and they don't talk to each other, right? So when they're out paying a prostitute, are they actually consciously thinking at that moment, this is a betrayal of my marriage vows and deeply disrespectful to my wife? No, they're actually not thinking that, because that's a different box. So so emotionally they go out of that box into another one. And this may sound really strange to people, but that's just what happens, right? And there can be some other things going on, like a type of dissociation, right? And it's important at this point to understand, and I think this ties to awareness, because it's important to understand the neurochemistry of the addiction cycle, I call it. So let's say a guy's going to see a prostitute. So he goes through the same series of steps every time, and it just repeats over and over. So it starts with a trigger. So he's bored, lonely, angry, frustrated, mad at his wife, let's say, feeling deprived, whatever that is. But there's something, I'm not making excuses. These are just things that are setting the ball in motion, okay? Mm-hmm. This is a learned behavior too, by the way. So then he has euphoric recall, which is, a memory of another time that he went to a massage parlor or saw an escort, and it felt good, and so that just comes back into his mind. It's the same reward circuits in your brain as you would engage if you were thinking about eating cheesecake, because you remember last week you went to a friend's house and they had a really nice piece of cheesecake, and suddenly you think of that cheesecake. That's euphoric recall, except yours is about food. Well, it's kind of it's just a suggestion. It's kind of like, hey, what about, like, if I was a little voice in your head, I would sound like, hey, Andrea, like, cheesecake, yeah, and I would show you a picture. That's all I do. I just, just sort of put it out there, and you're like, oh, yeah, right? Then the thought distortions. That's the next thing. So never underestimate the capacity of human beings to deceive themselves and justify their own behavior, especially when they already have a goal in mind, right? So I've talked to many, many men, hundreds of them over the years, and they all have the same thought patterns, okay? But what she doesn't know won't hurt her. No one will find out. With porn, especially, I'm not cheating. It's not like I'm cheating. I'm not having sex with anybody, right? They have oral sex with the escort, but I'm not cheating if it's oral sex. And I'm like, I know it's ridiculous, but that's what I mean about people's ability to deceive themselves, right? It's quite astounding, actually. A lot of entitlement comes in here. It's really important to talk about that, entitlement. Entitlement's fueled by deprivation, though, among other things. But a very powerful factor in feeling entitled is feeling deprived. And there's other things as well. But so anyway, so that's 10 seconds. They rationalize it away in about 10 seconds. Now, as they're making the appointment on their phone and, say, driving to the motel to meet the escort, a shift changes in their brain chemistry, where the reward center of the brain, it goes into what's called anticipatory excitement. So the dopamine spikes. So this is the highest level of dopamine. And they haven't actually acted out yet. They haven't actually watched porn or met the escort. But the anticipation of the reward literally sends them into a sort of dissociative state. Sometimes they get butterflies in their stomach, their hands are shaking, they're breaking out in a sweat, and they're on their way down to the motel to meet this person for sex. So when the wife is in my office crying and saying, weren't you thinking about me while you were driving down to bang that whore, the answer is, truthfully, no. Mm-hmm. I wasn't. And the reason is they were in an altered state, similar to being dissociated. A trance, we call it the trance, right? That's actually the goal, okay? the prostituted women they're paying for access to is the tool. And I don't,
Largely
that sounds,
irrelevant.
well, it sounds bad when I say she's a tool, but what I mean conceptually is in the process, she's a means to an end, right?
Yeah.
And I'm
No, and
sure, yeah.
that makes a lot of
What?
sense, actually. Just to quickly add before you continue on, is we have a man who comes and speaks at our John School, and he dealt with sexual compulsive behavior for many years, and he would talk about this. This was, he's been reformed and healed for many years and speaks there obviously now. So, but he talks about being active like when the street exploitation was still the thing before even internet. And he talks about the hunt, and he says, I didn't even care about the woman. I didn't care what she looked like. I didn't care anything. I might have a preference, but it was the
Yeah,
hunt, the
yeah.
the driving around the streets and the
That's the
familiarity of.
anticipatory excitement I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then it's funny because you talk to them, and there's sometimes even so let's say they go to the motel and the woman shows up, and there's still sometimes enough awareness in guys, and I've heard them tell me, like, I could tell as soon as she showed up she didn't want to be there. Like, they know, right? Or she really wasn't into it, right? Or she couldn't wait to get out, or the sex wasn't even really that good. And so that's sort of the beginning of like these sort of glimmers of, hey, this is a human being with feelings, right?
The shattering of the image slightly.
Right. But sometimes it doesn't go that way. It can go the other way because, maybe she fakes really being into him and enjoying it, like they're trained to do, or, you've told me from your stories working in the brothel was like, oh yeah, I'm so into you. And, you would actually play it up to, so they could just get off quicker, actually get it over with and get them out there.
Exactly.
But that was all part of the game. And so it goes the other way with some men where they actually think, they have a relationship with these people. And this happens for some reason more online, it seems, than like actual face-to-face sexual encounters with escorts, but more with their OnlyFans subscriptions, or, cam girls and things like that, where they play the game. And I think at some level, some of the guys know it's all an act, but they're happy to go along with it. But they play this game where, they think he's attractive and they compliment him and they're into him. And, as long as he keeps feeding money, of course, they'll do what he wants, right? Mm-hmm. Then you have a situation where, let's say, this is a true story of a client I had a few years ago who grew up in a South American country and saw porn. His dad routinely cheated, saw escorts, and watched porn his whole childhood. That's what he grew up seeing. So children normalize what they're exposed to. So they think this is what you do, this is normal, this is how society works, this is how men act. And he remembers his dad giving him a job one day, which was to edit all his porn tapes. He had a collection of VHS porn videos, and he wanted his son to watch them all, pick his favorite scenes, and edit them together into kind of a highlight reel and bring it back to his dad, right?
Ugh, that's gross.
And, right. And then, but I'm saying this to get people to think about the impact on that kid of that, right? Yeah. And then when he turned 16, it was take you to the hooker and make a man out of you. So he paid to take him to a prostitute and make a man out of him. And it actually was, he did not remember it as a pleasurable experience. It was quite uncomfortable and unpleasant for him.
It's very sad.
Yeah, it was very sad. But guess what? He grew up to be a porn addict, right? And then I'm like, you never had a chance, buddy. Like, really. Like, you were groomed into it by your father, and it was completely normalized in the world that you lived in and you grew up in, right? So why would it occur to him, if all he's ever heard from all the important men in his life that hookers are they have it easy, they just have sex for money, You know, there's nothing wrong with it, and there's nothing wrong with you know, paying them to, you know, do what you want. Like, why? Like, if that's all you've ever heard, why would you think of anything different?
Yeah, there's no counter rhetoric to
There's no
use
counter
as
narrative.
a comparative. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know for me, like, the extent of my critical analysis of pornography was, it's, you know, hot people that like having sex and get paid for it. That was it. It was very simplistic. I never thought beyond that, to be honest with you. And it wasn't until, you know, I really started my own recovery about 20 years ago, and I read Gail Dine's book, actually, that blew my mind, Pornland, that rocked my world, because she really just tells about, like, modern porn. And I hadn't even realized how bad it got. Like we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, you know, I was like, grew up in Playboy, Penthouse, and even when I watched porn online, it was pretty, I don't want to say vanilla, but it was pretty vanilla. I never liked any of that stuff. Like, women being hurt or anything was a complete turnoff to me. I just couldn't understand why anyone would even like that, right? So when I realized that there was rampant, that the internet was just infested with these horrifying sites, you know, it was quite shocking to me. And I actually had to stop researching this stuff for a while because it was making me sick, to be honest with you. It really was. Like, that book almost made me sick reading it. And I realized what a dark, twisted, depraved, vile, exploitative, hateful industry porn is, and what it actually does to people. So that was about a 2-year process. So I call it my waking up phase, you know. And it is like, because it's not like these men aren't intelligent. You know, I deal with all kinds of men, and some of them are highly educated professionals, you know, lawyers, doctors, whatever. It's not like they're not smart. They're not aware. They're
Same
not
with
aware.
the Johns. Yeah. Doctors, lawyers, you know, brain surgeons, people that are getting paid $600K a year. And you're like, how can you not put 2 and 2 together of what you're participating in right now? You know, it's what's right in front of you.
And then there's another element. If we're talking about why men buy sex, like here's just a very straightforward utilitarian perspective. Client who's well-to-do, he's one of those professionals we just mentioned, lots of money, and a couple of years into his marriage, his wife just stopped having sex with him. I don't really remember what the reason was. It was nothing that he did to her. Like, he wasn't abusive to her. He wasn't an alcoholic. He was, you know, just a normal guy. And so she just stopped having sex and told him, I'm pretty much like, we're not really going to have sex anymore. Like, she had kids. She had her kids. I just married you, I guess, to get kids, and we're done with the sex. So he found himself in a bit of a predicament because he didn't want to live the rest of his life not having sex. And could he have tried maybe to go to counseling and fix it that way? Sure. But let's say he even tried that and she adamantly refused to go to counseling or even discuss the issue. It's a closed book. So now he's in a situation here where, what do you do? And I'm not trying to, you know, make excuses for this. I'm just telling you the stories there's a lot of reasons that guys go down this road, and that was one of them. And I'm sure you've heard this from guys too, Andrew, you know, back in the day. But so we thought, okay, well, once a month when I go to Toronto on a business trip, I'll just hire a prostitute and, you know, I'll just pay her. And he always told me, like, I never treated them bad, you know, I never hit them, I was never mean to them. I just said, okay, here's your $200. We had intercourse, cleaned up, he left and went home. Now, that was it. And he didn't feel guilty because the way he looked at it was, it's, you provide a service, this is the service that I want, and we're doing a transaction. It was no different in his mind than going to the gas station because his car was empty and he needed to fill it up.
Yes, that's such a good way to put it. And I noticed that was a big part of my journey in prostitution as well, was me saying those things to myself, right? These men aren't abusing me. This is not unconsensual sex because they are paying me. They're not striking me, hitting me, pimping me, any of these things. They're the nice guys. And same thing, you know, loveless marriages. And Oh,
Yeah.
I look back with honestly just just confusion as to how um, I could have made so many excuses for what was actually in front of me. But I think
Mhm.
we see that on both the supply and demand side, right? Is that nobody wants to be a victim or a victimizer. So they will, like you said, compartmentalize and reframe and kind of restructure that and justify and rationalize how they see fit. But that was probably one of the more common ones was my wife won't have sex with me anymore. And I always say it was probably about 90% of the men who came to see me that were married, so it wasn't, the lonely single guys. And of course
No.
there are those guys, but it's really something I think deeper about it speaks to our relational issues as well, beyond just sex, where, like you said, there's lack of communication, or there's entitlement, or there's, just things that haven't come to the surface to actually be worked through. And so, I think if people actually went to therapy, many women would stop selling sex and forget about the big money that comes with that often. And many men would, take measures to stop participating as buyers if they could see really somebody like yourself who is caring and empathetic and is not coming from a place of judgment, but challenges them ideologically and emotionally to examine the narratives that we tell ourselves to stay in these places of comfort, rather than, looking at ourselves and saying, I've done something wrong, or I've endorsed a narrative that
Yeah.
is harmful to others.
And then I can give you a story almost from the opposite side, where I met with a couple, different ethnic culture. They're in Canada but born in another country, and in their culture, basically the wife gives sex whenever he wants. So this guy could literally have sex whenever he wanted, but went to massage parlors because it was exciting and new and different, and maybe he's just being selfish.
Well, and I think it's also more catered one-sided sex.
Mhm.
Whereas, if you're having sex between equals, there is that reciprocity, there is that trust, that respect. Whereas when you are, the customer, quote unquote, you don't have to give any attention or any consideration to that person and their feelings. It's all about meeting that desire that you have within yourself solely, and not
Yeah.
thinking about anyone else. And I think that that's really a big lure in our hyper individualized world, that
Mhm.
it's, you can just set anything down at the table, or at the door, sorry, and just leave it there and not even have to think about the other person. It's all just about you. And that's, I think, where I struggle the most with all of it, because as I left prostitution and, started doing this type of work and stuff, I've realized how important collectivism is. And to see people act so individually, like they're in this silo, and not
Mhm.
see how you throw a rock into the pond and there's the ripples that come from it. That's really the hard part, to try to prompt people to look at the world with a new lens. And I don't know really what changes that makes people do that. That's the big question, is how do you shift that? So I guess, how does therapy shift that? Like, is that a big part of therapy, is just trying to almost put that sensitivity chip into people and that empathy and awareness? Or like, is there more to it? Because obviously I know it's unique to each man what the therapy journey is like, but it definitely, of course, has to be some type of deprogramming, but also then putting in something new in
Yeah.
their psyche. So it's erasing something, but you're also putting in something new. So can you describe kind of what the therapy journey looks like for a guy who just says, I've had enough, I don't want to participate in this anymore, and he finds
Mhm.
you and reaches out to you? Like, what's the next steps? Where does it go from there?
Yeah. Well, most guys show up in my office because they've been caught doing something, and they're in trouble. So there's pain. And pain, men change through pain. So there has to be an introduction of a pain agent to motivate them to change. And that's usually the threat of losing their marriage and family. Um, I've had men lose their jobs or come close. I have one client who was spent hours a day looking at porn at work, and this went on for, I don't know, a long time. And HR finally caught up to him, and they pulled him into the office one day with, HR and his boss and his boss's boss, and they basically said, "We know what you've been doing, and you're on leave right now." And he went away for treatment. They had a treatment center back then, and it was literally traumatic for him. Like, it was the most humiliating traumatic experience of his entire life. But it shook him out of his fog and got him on the path, right? But a lot of times it's just guys show up because they've got caught by their wives. So I usually start with, why do you want to quit porn? I want to know what their why is. I want to know what's motivating them, because the one thing I can't give people is motivation. I can give them tools, strategies, and support and help and insight, but I can't motivate them. That has to come from them. And I want to find out, really dig into the negative consequences. And like I say, like the vast majority of my clients are just like, really good guys that have values and ethics. So I started to flesh out with them, like, what are your values, And you always hear the same things, like family and work and trust and my kids and love and, keeping your word and having integrity. Like, believe it or not, most people still actually hold to these things. So I ask them how their behavior conflicts with their values. So I start to bring up to the surface the inherent contradictions in their life. Like, you say that you value integrity and you want to be a good role model to your kids. So how does that jive with it? Like, why don't you bring your kid down to the brothel next time and say, just sit here, Johnny, while daddy goes in and gets a blowjob from that person in there, and make sure you don't tell mommy, because that's cheating on her. And I sometimes I even come up with these ridiculous, like, I'll say it like that. I'll come up with these ridiculous things to shock them into, like, yeah, like, you're right. What was I thinking? And I get very specific on behaviors that they want to stop doing. So I call them bottom lines. So bottom lines are, like, for me, they're I don't use porn, I don't masturbate, I don't engage in inappropriate contact with women, and I don't have lies or secrets. So those are my 4 bottom lines. And most of my clients end up somewhere along, in the same area as those, maybe give or take 1 or 2. So that's where we start, right? And then we start talking about how to get them sober, I call it, from engaging in those behaviors. So that's my focus for like 3 months. And then they have to get enough traction, Andrea, for the fog to lift. I call it the fog.
Okay. Me too. I always use that phrase.
Yeah. Did you steal it from me or what?
I may have. I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah,
okay.
But I like it because it talks about a dissipation, a slow dissipation.
It
because
is.
It's not like ripping off this Band-Aid, like, where people think we just wake up one day and we're like, oh, I, don't like who I am. I don't like what I'm doing. I totally understand the whole thing now.
Yeah,
it's not
like
the switch. Yeah,
no.
It's a slow erosion of our thoughts and our beliefs.
So as 3 to 6 months usually, as the fog lifts and they're starting to really see changes and they're happy with who they are, this is when I start having the conversations about empathy. And like, a lot of my clients aren't sex buyers, right? Probably like the majority, meaning more than 50% of them are not sex buyers. But I see that regularly as well. And then I start introducing the idea of, like, you ever think about these women, like, even in porn, like, why they're there? That most of them have been raped and abused already, and they're addicted to drugs and alcohol, and a lot of times they have a pimp who takes all their money. And they're like, sometimes they're like, really? Like, I had no idea. Or they're like, yeah, I'm starting to read stuff. A lot of them will get very involved in learning. They will listen to podcasts. They will watch videos on my YouTube channel. They will read books on this stuff, and they really want to educate themselves on this. And you see them slowly over time, 6 to 12 months, you see them starting to shift, starting to think differently, starting to use different words in the vocabulary. Some of the empathy starts to come back. Okay. And I think that's directly a result of getting away from porn, because I meant to mention this earlier though, but porn because we're talking about the demand for sex and paying for sex, porn creates the John, Andrea. Mm-hmm. Porn creates all the necessary preconditions for a man to actually go out and pay money for sex. Okay,
Yeah,
they have to. Yeah,
I don't think I ever in my time in prostitution ever met a man who paid for sex that was not also simultaneously a porn consumer. I
right.
did meet a man later who said that he was not ever a porn user and he purchased sex, but that was the first person I'd ever heard about, going that trajectory, that path
Yeah,
into
I don't believe him
prostitution.
either. Anyway, I don't believe him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I think like there's still something you
So
don't
there's a
just.
99.9% correlation between consuming pornography and buying sex, because porn teaches you to objectify women. It teaches you that women are there to meet your sexual needs. It teaches you that women never say no and are easily accessible. And it teaches you that they're objects without feelings. And what do we do with feelings or with objects? We use objects and we love people.
Yeah.
We're not supposed to love objects and use people.
Yeah,
So the inversion, you have to have the inversion, right? And so when that's the learning through repetition, so you watch the video, you insert yourself into it, you masturbate and have an orgasm that neurochemically reinforces the scenario that you just watched. It literally creates neural pathways in your brain to want it again. And so do that 1,000 times, and then going down to a brothel to pay for sex doesn't seem like a big leap after that. In a lot of ways, it seems like the next natural step.
Yeah. And what's so interesting too is like people always like to counter what you just said by saying, well, people watch violent movies all the time, but they don't go off and kill people. But I think that there has to be something different with like the process addiction that comes about through pornography and seeing it every day versus violent media. Like I think that there still is some desensitizing that obviously occurs through violent video games and violent media. Like people might say no, and I think a lot of studies have tried to argue it doesn't happen because of course they're funded by people who make money, putting out that content. But what's your take? Because I'm sure that's probably the argument that you probably hear a lot from people is, well, watching violent movies don't make people into serial killers, watching all those true crime docs. So like, how does porn make somebody into a sex buyer?
Well, my answer would be, if watching Arnold Schwarzenegger mow down 50 guys with a machine gun gave you an orgasm, you might find ways to recreate that scenario somehow.
So it's again that physiological response of linking it to pleasure.
Not just a physiological, the most potent physiological response that the human body can get. So what happens, let's say you're watching a rape video and you're masturbating and you have an orgasm. To your reward center, this isn't I'm getting off on another woman's suffering. Okay, this is a path to a reward. Simple. The limbic brain's amoral. Right? The reward center is amoral. It doesn't care how it gets dopamine. It just wants dopamine. The prefrontal cortex is kind of offline. Remember we talked about the altered state.
Yes, yeah.
So you're in a dissociative state anyway. I don't think you're dissociating watching Arnold Schwarzenegger in Commando mowing guys down with a machine gun. It's completely different, brain chemistry wise, right? And plus, it gets interesting because going and having sex is a normal behavior. Mowing people down with a machine gun is still seriously frowned upon by society and is going to get you in trouble. So it's apples and oranges. Like it's a stupid argument. I know what you're saying, but it's just stupid.
No, thank you for clarifying that. Because sometimes I come up against these challenges and I'm kind of like, well, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a neurologist. Like, I don't know how these things
you're on Twitter too much, Andrea.
Yeah, that is making me neurotic, but that is different from being a neurologist. So.
Yeah. Well, and then I'll say one more thing. I wonder, and maybe I'm sure there's studies on this. I wonder if watching thousands of hours of brutally violent movies doesn't affect your empathy somehow.
Yeah,
I bet it does.
Too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's an argument of extremes, like, well, it doesn't make you a serial killer. It's like, well, come on, like almost no one's a serial killer anyway, so it's a stupid argument to begin with. But does it desensitize you to violence? Probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm
I
pretty
would think
sure.
so too. Like,
Yeah.
to me, it just seems like it would be a natural consequence when you apply logic and reasoning to it, like basic logic.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think again that goes into that compartmentalization of what you're talking about, where it's like, this is different. It's not that. There's no correlation. We can't compare this to that. Like, these are all kind of those larger systems, though, that serve to divide us, I think, and separate us, and take away our humanity and our empathy for one another. I want to finish with one last question, and that's really about best practices. So obviously, my position is abolition for all of, anything that has to do with power differentials introduced within sexual engagements, any type of, commercialization of it in any regard. I'm quite a staunch abolitionist, but, what is best practices, I guess, that are commonly accepted in the therapy world? Like, is it one of abstinence completely? Because people will say, well, again, it's kind of going back to what you said about food, right? Like, you can't stop eating, but you might have a problem overeating. And I know that people can stop having sex, but the likelihood of that is quite slim to none, because it is an activity that is innate to human nature. So, maybe abstinence isn't really the recommendation of therapists, or is it? Or, what is the ideal path forward that are really offered to men who maybe aren't finding it themselves, or having that introspection to be like, for me, I have to abstain from this. Like, how do they make progress? What are some good best practices, good resources?
So first of all, just talking about sex, like sex itself, paying for sex always becomes, a bottom line. Guys are like, I don't want to do that anymore. And for obvious reasons. I mean, if they're in a relationship, that's a no-go to begin with. But the goal isn't stopping sex. The goal is relational, connected sex that's not done in a compulsive way, marked by obsession and preoccupation. So we have conversations about what healthy sex looks like. I'm not anti-sex whatsoever. I think sex is great.
Mm-hmm.
But I think sex is like a fire. So, a fire is great when you have boundaries around it, and you have a fireplace in the house with stones and a chimney to vent it properly, and you just put enough wood on to heat the room. So a fire is great. But if you just throw a bunch of wood in the middle of the kitchen and pour gas on it and light it on fire, well, that's a fire too. But it's going to do a lot of damage and probably burn the house down. So it's about sex in the right way, at the right time, in the right place. And I don't mean right like in a moral or religious way or any of that stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about right in the sense of what's respectful to you and to your partner and is life-giving, right? How do you use that in a healthy and life-giving way? And all the other things like porn and it's abstinence. It's abstinence. Because I tell guys, I say, like, if you're actually addicted to this, it's not like a little bit of heroin. You never hear a heroin addict say, well, I just use heroin occasionally once in a while. It's an all or nothing thing, or a cocaine addict or an alcoholic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Usually masturbation, it's the same. With some people, there's some exceptions where there's no secret masturbation. And I'm pretty adamant about this because the most important bottom line for people in relationships is no lies or secrets. But we have a conversation about masturbation too. I'm like, hey, if you talk to your wife and she's okay with, in certain situations, maybe you're away on a business trip and you want to call each other up and do some phone sex and flirty, and you masturbate or she does, or you're directing your sexual energy to your partner. That's what I put forward as a goal. what if all your sexual energy is only directed to your partner? And I've never had anyone tell me that was a bad idea. Mm-hmm. So if masturbation can fit into that, like, hey, sure, I'm not, I don't have an opinion on it apart from if it's paired with porn and is secret, it's a problem. That's how I look at that, right? Sort of, best practices, regular therapy, pulling apart the triggers and the things that went into their story. Like there's always a history of early exposure to porn, trauma, sexual abuse. Like there's always things that went on behind the scenes that got them to where they are. So we want to unpack that, put in a lot of real practical strategies in place for guys to actually have a plan that they can use to get free. I give them lots of resources to look at, podcasts, books to read. I highly encourage participation in a group of some kind. There's actually 12-step groups out there and non-12-step groups out there for men to get in a community of other people that want to support them. Mm-hmm. And working with couples, I help him to work with his wife or girlfriend who will be usually experiencing some kind of betrayal trauma, to learn how to validate her, to take ownership for what he's done, to stop being defensive and angry. There's a lot going on, right? Besides his recovery, there's her trauma. And sometimes, ideally, I get to meet the partner and work with them. I don't always meet the partner. And also help with, moving the relationship forward. So, that's it. And accountability.
So it's basically just reinforcing, what we've kind of said throughout this whole conversation, in that there is no quick fixes. Like it does take a lot of work and time and character development and unraveling of narratives and creating that collective consciousness and developing that critical eye for, these commercialized systems and how they take advantage of all of us, men and women. None of us are really immune from that. So wow. Well, honestly, Paul, I always tell you offline that, I appreciate you and I admire you and I really look up to you in so many ways just for your knowledge and your insights. And I really appreciate how you apply your life experiences as well, too, because I think that you just have this beautiful energy about you that makes people feel comfortable to be vulnerable and to, really show their worst side of themselves and the things that they probably don't tell other people, that they have done and wish that they had not done. And I'm just really so thankful, that you're out here and that you're doing this work, because I think also too, there is this gender bias where, if a man is dealing with pornography addiction and he has a female therapist, there is still a little bit of that divide at times. And I think that we really do need men in these spaces doing this type of work that you're doing. And every day I'm just so grateful that not only that you're out here doing this work, but that I can call you a friend and that I can, call on you to give me some insights on things that I don't understand from that therapy lens and that higher level of reasoning, because I think too, when you're an experiential woman or survivor of prostitution, it's very hard to not let your emotions cloud you sometimes and to, have rage at times that leads your cognitive processes. So I just really appreciate that you're such a well-rounded human and that you're so grounded and that you're here helping people, myself included. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I admire and respect you very much as well for everything you've been through and all the work that you do to speak about this. And you put up with way more abuse than I do on just online alone. I don't know how you do it. But it's just, ever since I interviewed you on my YouTube channel, I was so impressed with how you've dealt with what's happened to you, and you've transformed that trauma and abuse that you endured into a hopeful narrative for other people. And what you have to say is very important, and what this podcast is about is very important. So just really glad for having a chance to get on here, and I hope 1 million people hear it one day.
Oh, that means so much. We hope the same thing, and we definitely will have to have you back again, because I feel like we just barely scratched the surface, and we actually covered a lot, but I feel like, all these things could be a conversation on their own. So
Yeah,
I really look
anytime.
forward to influencing you to come back on, pressuring you. All
Anytime,
right.
Andrea. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.